He killed without warning. He taunted police. He mailed cryptic messages to newspapers. And more than 50 years later, nobody knows who he was. This is the terrifying mystery of the Zodiac Killer. December 20th, 1968. Just 5 days before Christmas. Across America, families are decorating their homes. Children are counting down the final days until Christmas morning. Storefronts glow with holiday lights, and communities are preparing to celebrate the most wonderful time of the year. But on a lonely stretch of road outside Vallejo, California, the holiday spirit feels very far away. The night is cold. The sky is black. And silence hangs over the empty countryside. Lake Herman Road is little more than a narrow ribbon of pavement cutting through the darkness. Surrounded by open fields and rolling hills, it is isolated, quiet, and largely forgotten once the sun goes down. For local teenagers, however, the area is familiar. A place to talk. A place to escape. A place where young couples can spend a few peaceful hours away from the eyes of parents and neighbors. On this particular night, two teenagers believe they are simply enjoying another ordinary date. They have no reason to be afraid. No reason to believe they are in danger. No reason to suspect that someone may already be watching them from the darkness. Somewhere nearby, a killer waits. Patient. Silent. Hidden. Within hours, 17-year-old David Faraday and 16-year-old Betty Lou Jensen will become victims of a crime so shocking that it will leave investigators searching for answers for decades. Their murders will mark the beginning of one of the most terrifying criminal investigations in American history. An investigation that will stretch across multiple counties, generate thousands of leads, consume countless hours of police work, and captivate the world for more than half a century. But what made this killer different wasn't simply the violence. America had seen killers before. The country had witnessed murderers, fugitives, and violent criminals throughout its history. The horror of the Zodiac case was not only found at the crime scenes. It was found in what happened afterward. Because unlike most killers, this one didn't want to hide. He wanted to be seen. He wanted to be heard. And he wanted the world to remember him. Soon, newspapers across Northern California would begin receiving mysterious letters. Letters filled with threats. Letters containing bizarre symbols and coded messages. Letters written by someone who seemed to take pleasure in spreading fear. A person who treated murder like a game. A person who appeared to enjoy taunting the very people trying to stop him. And with every letter he sent, the mystery only grew deeper. Who was he? Why was he doing this? And how could someone commit such crimes while remaining invisible? The answers never came. Instead, the letters continued. The threats escalated. And the legend began to grow. A legend built on fear. Built on uncertainty. Built on a name that would become infamous around the world. The Zodiac. Over the next several years, the Zodiac Killer would taunt police, mock investigators, and challenge entire communities to decipher his messages. He would claim responsibility for multiple attacks. He would send cryptic ciphers to newspapers. He would threaten further violence. And he would transform himself from an unknown murderer into one of the most recognizable criminals in modern history. Yet despite the attention, despite the evidence, despite the massive investigation that followed, he was never caught. No arrest. No confession. No definitive identification. Only questions. Questions that continue to haunt investigators more than 50 years later. Who wrote the letters? Who created the ciphers? Who terrorized Northern California? And perhaps most importantly, how did he get away with it? More than half a century later, investigators, journalists, authors, and amateur detectives are still searching for the answer. An answer buried somewhere beneath decades of evidence, theories, witness statements, and forgotten clues. An answer that has remained hidden for generations. Who was the Zodiac Killer? To understand the fear that surrounded the Zodiac Killer, we first need to understand the world in which he emerged. The late 1960s were a period of enormous change in America. Across the country, social tensions were rising. The Vietnam War dominated headlines. Night after night, television screens brought images of conflict directly into American living rooms. Thousands of young men were being drafted into military service. Families waited anxiously for letters from loved ones stationed overseas. And a growing divide was beginning to shape the nation. Protests filled city streets. College campuses became centers of political activism. Demonstrations erupted from coast to coast as Americans debated the future of their country. Trust in institutions was beginning to crack. Many citizens questioned their leaders. Others questioned the media. And some wondered whether the America they had grown up believing in was beginning to change forever. Yet despite the uncertainty that existed on a national level, many communities throughout Northern California still felt relatively safe. Life moved at a slower pace. People knew their neighbors. Children played outside until sunset. Families often left their doors unlocked. In towns scattered across the Bay Area and surrounding counties, there remained a sense of comfort and familiarity. It was the kind of environment where serious violence felt distant. Something that happened somewhere else. Something that happened in big cities. Not here. Not to us. For teenagers growing up during this era, freedom was often taken for granted. On weekends, young couples piled into cars and drove to quiet roads, scenic overlooks, and secluded gathering spots. Parents worried about curfews. They worried about grades. They worried about who their children were dating. But very few worried that their sons or daughters might encounter a serial killer. The idea seemed almost unimaginable. In communities like Vallejo, Benicia, Napa, and the surrounding areas, life followed familiar routines. Schools opened each morning. Local businesses served regular customers. Churches filled on Sundays. Neighbors exchanged greetings across fences. Everything appeared normal. Everything appeared secure. Yet beneath that sense of normalcy, something was quietly changing. America was entering an era that would become infamous for a new kind of criminal. The serial killer. Throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s, several notorious offenders would emerge across the country. Many of them operated in secret. Many of them blended into everyday society. And many would remain unidentified for years. Law enforcement agencies were still learning how to investigate these kinds of crimes. The concept of criminal profiling was in its infancy. Communication between jurisdictions was often limited. Modern forensic technologies did not yet exist. Investigators relied heavily on witness accounts, physical evidence, and intuition. When a clever offender covered his tracks, solving a case could become extraordinarily difficult. But even among the criminals who would terrorize America during this period, the Zodiac was different. Most killers tried to avoid attention. The Zodiac sought it. Most killers feared publicity. The Zodiac appeared to crave it. Most killers hid in the shadows. The Zodiac would eventually step into the spotlight and dare the world to stop him. At first, however, no one knew he existed. There were no headlines. No warnings. No ciphers. No cryptic letters. Only an unknown individual moving unnoticed through Northern California. Living somewhere. Working somewhere. Blending into everyday life. Perhaps sitting beside strangers in restaurants. Perhaps passing unnoticed through crowded stores. Perhaps living just a few streets away from people who would one day read about his crimes and horror. The most frightening possibility of all was that the Zodiac may have appeared completely ordinary. As Christmas approached in December of 1968, the residents of Northern California continued with their daily lives. Holiday decorations appeared in windows. Families prepared for celebrations. School breaks were just around the corner. For most people, the coming weeks promised joy, laughter, and time spent with loved ones. No one could have imagined that one lonely road outside Vallejo was about to become the starting point of a mystery that would endure for generations. A mystery that would produce countless suspects. Thousands of theories. And one of the largest unsolved investigations in American history. On the night of December 20, 1968, two young people set out on what should have been an ordinary date. Neither knew they were about to become part of history. Neither knew their names would be remembered more than 50 years later. And neither knew that somewhere in the darkness, a killer was waiting. A killer whose actions would soon introduce the world to a name it would never forget. The Zodiac. By the winter of 1968, a tragedy that would leave a permanent scar on an entire community. And unknowingly, marked the beginning of one of the most infamous criminal investigations in American history. At the center of that story were two young people with their entire lives ahead of them. 17-year-old David Faraday was known as a respectful and intelligent teenager. Teachers spoke highly of him. Friends described him as dependable and kind. He was the type of young man who seemed destined for a bright future. Recently, David had begun dating 16-year-old Betty Lou Jensen. Betty Lou was energetic, friendly, and well-liked by those who knew her. Like many young couples, they enjoyed spending time together away from the watchful eyes of parents and family members. Their relationship was still new. Their future still unwritten. And on the evening of December 20, 1968, they set out on what should have been an ordinary date. Nothing unusual. Nothing dangerous. Just another Friday night. A night that neither could have known would be their last. Sometime that evening, David and Betty Lou drove toward a remote area known as Lake Herman Road. The location was well known among local teenagers. Far removed from busy neighborhoods and city traffic, it offered privacy and solitude. Young couples often parked there to talk, listen to music, and enjoy time together. It was quiet. Peaceful. Hidden from the rest of the world. But that same isolation would soon become deadly. As darkness settled over the countryside, Lake Herman Road became almost completely deserted. The distant lights of town faded into the background. The night grew colder. And somewhere in that darkness, another vehicle approached. Whoever was behind the wheel remains one of the greatest mysteries in criminal history. Shortly before 11 p.m., passing motorists noticed something disturbing. A vehicle sat parked near the road. At first glance, nothing appeared unusual. But nearby, illuminated only by headlights and darkness, lay two motionless bodies. David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen had been shot. The scene was shocking. Brutal. And deeply confusing. David was discovered near the vehicle. Betty Lou had attempted to escape. Investigators would later determine that she had run a significant distance in a desperate attempt to survive. But she never made it to safety. Within minutes, emergency personnel and law enforcement officers rushed to the scene. What they found raised more questions than answers. There was no obvious sign of robbery. No indication of a struggle that suggested a personal dispute. No evidence that either victim had been targeted because of something they had done. The attack appeared random. Senseless. Almost as if the victims had been selected simply because they happened to be there. For investigators, this possibility was deeply unsettling. Random crimes are among the most difficult to solve. When there is no clear connection between offender and victim, there is often little for detectives to follow. And in this case, clues were painfully limited. Investigators began examining every detail. The position of the vehicle. The location of shell casings. Tire impressions left behind at the scene. Potential witness sightings. Anything that might reveal who had committed the murders. But despite their efforts, the picture remained incomplete. The killer had arrived. Committed the crime. And disappeared back into the night. Without a name. Without a face. Without leaving investigators a clear path forward. As news of the murders spread through the community, fear began to grow. Parents worried about their children. Students whispered about the attack in school hallways. Residents struggled to understand how such violence could occur in an area they considered safe. Yet despite public concern, detectives found themselves facing a frustrating reality. They had no strong suspects. No clear motive. And no explanation for why David and Betty Lou had been targeted. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Investigators interviewed friends, classmates, family members, and anyone who might provide useful information. They explored numerous theories. Was it a personal attack? A jealous rival? A random act of violence. Every possibility was examined. But none fit perfectly. Every lead seemed to end in disappointment. And slowly, the case began to lose momentum. Public attention shifted elsewhere. New crimes occupied newspaper headlines. The investigation remained active, but progress became increasingly difficult. For many people, it seemed possible that the murders on Lake Herman Road might never be solved. That David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen would become victims of a mystery destined to remain unanswered. But investigators had no way of knowing that this crime was only the beginning. Because somewhere out there, the killer was still free. And he wasn't finished. 7 months later, Northern California would be shaken by another attack. An attack that would reveal a terrifying truth. The murders at Lake Herman Road had not been an isolated act of violence. They had been the opening chapter of something much larger. Something far more dangerous. On the night of July 4, 1969, 22-year-old Darlene Ferrin and 19-year-old Michael Mageau parked their vehicle at Blue Rock Springs Park. The location was only a few miles from Lake Herman Road. The similarities would later become impossible to ignore. Like David and Betty Lou months earlier, the pair were spending time together in a secluded area. The atmosphere seemed peaceful. Safe. Ordinary. But history was about to repeat itself. As they sat inside their vehicle, another car entered the parking area. It stopped nearby. For a moment, nothing happened. Then it drove away. Perhaps the occupants felt relieved. Perhaps they assumed it was simply another visitor. But only minutes later, the vehicle returned. This time, it stopped again. And the driver stepped out. Michael Mageau would later recall believing the approaching figure might be a police officer. The man's behavior seemed authoritative. Nothing immediately suggested danger. But within seconds, everything changed. Without warning, the stranger opened fire. The quiet of the night was shattered by gunshots. Darlene Ferrin was critically wounded. Michael Mageau was struck as well. Then something happened that investigators would never forget. The attacker briefly returned to his vehicle. And then came back. He approached the victims again and fired additional shots. The act suggested calculation. Control. A chilling determination to ensure maximum harm. This was not an impulsive attack. It was deliberate. Methodical. And terrifyingly efficient. Darlene Ferrin later died from her injuries. But Michael Mageau survived. For the first time, investigators had something they had lacked after the Lake Herman Road murders. An eyewitness. Someone who had seen the attacker. Someone who could provide information. Someone who might help identify the person responsible. But the most shocking development was still to come. Less than an hour after the shooting, a police dispatcher received a phone call. The caller spoke calmly. Matter-of-factly. Almost casually. He reported the crime. Then he made an extraordinary claim. He stated that he was also responsible for the murders of David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen. Suddenly, everything changed. The two investigations were no longer separate mysteries. They were connected. The realization sent shockwaves through law enforcement. This was not a single offender acting once. This was a serial killer. And he was still active. For months, the murders at Lake Herman Road had remained an unsolved puzzle. Now investigators faced a far more frightening reality. The killer had struck again. He was becoming bolder. More confident. And perhaps most disturbing of all, he appeared eager for recognition. The attacks at Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs terrified Northern California. But the most disturbing chapter of the story had not yet begun. Because within weeks, newspapers across the region would begin receiving mysterious letters. Letters filled with threats. Letters containing coded messages. Letters that would captivate the nation. And for the first time, the killer would give himself a name. The Zodiac. By the summer of 1969, fear was spreading throughout Northern California. What had initially appeared to be two separate acts of violence was beginning to look like something far more disturbing. 2 attacks. 3 victims dead. 1 survivor. and almost no clues pointing toward the killer's identity. Detectives in Vallejo worked around the clock. Investigators chased leads across multiple jurisdictions. Witnesses were interviewed. Evidence was re-examined. Reports were written and rewritten. Yet despite their efforts, the person responsible remained invisible. No arrest. No clear suspect. No explanation. The pressure was mounting. Families demanded answers. Newspapers demanded answers. The public demanded answers. But what investigators didn't realize was that the killer had no intention of remaining silent. In fact, he was preparing to do something that would transform a local murder investigation into a national phenomenon. He wasn't satisfied with murder alone. He wanted attention. He wanted fear. And more than anything else, he wanted control. On July 31, 1969, newspaper employees across Northern California began receiving unusual envelopes. At first glance, they appeared ordinary. Simple letters arriving through the mail. Nothing about them suggested they would soon become some of the most infamous documents in criminal history. But inside those envelopes was something deeply unsettling. 3 newspapers received nearly identical communications. The San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald. Each letter appeared to come from the same author. Each contained disturbing claims. And each carried a chilling message. The writer stated that he was responsible for both the Lake Herman Road murders and the Blue Rock Springs attack. Such claims alone might have been dismissed. After all, major crimes often attract false confessions. Attention seekers frequently attempt to insert themselves into investigations. But these letters contained something different. Details. Specific details. Information that had never been released publicly. Facts known only to investigators and the perpetrator. As detectives examined the letters, a frightening realization began to emerge. The author wasn't pretending. The author wasn't guessing. The author knew exactly what had happened. Because he had been there. But perhaps the most alarming part of the letters wasn't the confession. It was the demand. Enclosed with each message was a portion of a coded cipher. The writer instructed the newspapers to publish the cipher on their front pages. And he attached a threat. If the newspapers failed to comply, he warned that more people would die. The message placed editors in an impossible position. Publishing the cipher would give the killer exactly what he wanted. Attention. Publicity. Influence. But refusing his demands carried its own risks. What if the threat was genuine? What if withholding the message provoked further violence? Across newsrooms, discussions grew intense. Editors weighed ethical concerns against public safety. Journalists debated their responsibilities. Law enforcement officials offered guidance. Yet no one knew the correct answer. Because no one had ever faced a situation quite like this before. Ultimately, the newspapers chose to publish the cipher. And almost overnight, the mystery exploded into public consciousness. The story dominated headlines. People discussed it at work. At school. At dinner tables. Across California, citizens unfolded their morning newspapers and stared at rows of strange symbols. They wondered what secrets might be hidden inside. What message had the killer left behind? And could solving it somehow lead investigators to his identity? For the first time, ordinary citizens became participants in the investigation. The killer had succeeded in turning the entire public into his audience. The cipher itself appeared almost impossible to decipher. 408 symbols arranged into a complex pattern. Circles. Squares. Triangles. Crosses. Letters. Characters that seemed completely random. To most observers, it looked like nonsense. A meaningless collection of symbols designed only to confuse. But others believed a message was hidden within the code. A message waiting to be discovered. Law enforcement agencies examined the cipher. Cryptography experts analyzed it. Military code specialists reviewed its structure. Newspapers encouraged readers to attempt solutions. Yet days passed without a breakthrough. The code remained unsolved. And the mystery continued to grow. Then, unexpectedly, the breakthrough came not from a government agency or professional codebreaker. It came from a married couple. Donald Hardin and Betty Hardin. Working from their home in California, they began studying the symbols. They approached the problem with patience, logic, and persistence. Night after night, they examined patterns, tested theories, and slowly began uncovering the structure hidden beneath the chaos. Eventually, the code surrendered its secrets. The message revealed disturbing insight into the mind of the person who wrote it. The author described killing as something he enjoyed. He spoke about human life in a detached and disturbing manner. His words painted the picture of an individual who viewed violence not as tragedy, but as entertainment. For investigators, the contents were deeply unsettling. Not because they revealed who he was, but because they revealed how he thought. Yet when the final lines were decoded, one crucial piece of information was missing. His name. The killer had provided a confession. He had shared his thoughts. He had proven his connection to the crimes. But he had withheld the answer everyone wanted. His identity. It was a pattern that would define the entire Zodiac investigation. Every time investigators felt close to understanding him, the most important answer remained just out of reach. The successful decryption of the cipher generated enormous publicity. Newspapers printed the results. Radio stations discussed them. Television broadcasts covered the story. The killer's words reached millions of people. And with every headline, his notoriety grew. For most criminals, publicity is dangerous. Attention increases the risk of capture. Media exposure attracts investigators. Public awareness creates witnesses. But the Zodiac seemed to view publicity differently. He welcomed it. Perhaps even depended on it. The attention wasn't a consequence of his crimes. It was part of the crime itself. Fear was his weapon. Publicity was his fuel. And the media had become his chosen stage. As public fascination intensified, reports of additional communications began to emerge. Phone calls. Tips. Claims from individuals insisting they were the killer. Some were quickly dismissed. Others generated intense scrutiny. Determining which communications were authentic became increasingly difficult. The Zodiac's growing fame inspired imitators, pranksters, and attention seekers. Every new message had to be investigated. Every claim had to be examined. Every threat had to be taken seriously. For detectives already struggling to identify the killer, the situation became even more complicated. The investigation was no longer focused solely on solving murders. It was also about separating truth from fiction. And in that environment, confusion became another weapon working in the killer's favor. Then came another letter. And with it, a moment that would change the case forever. For the first time, the writer identified himself using a specific name. A single word. Simple. Memorable. Mysterious. Zodiac. No one knows exactly why he chose it. Perhaps it held personal significance. Perhaps it was selected simply because it sounded dramatic. Perhaps it was intended to enhance the mythology he was creating around himself. Whatever the reason, the effect was immediate. The name captured public imagination. Newspapers embraced it. Television broadcasts repeated it. Investigators were forced to use it. And from that moment forward, the unknown killer was no longer an anonymous gunman. He was the Zodiac Killer. A name that would endure for generations. As the weeks passed, fear spread throughout Northern California. Parents warned their children to be careful. Teenagers avoided secluded areas. Young couples reconsidered places they once considered safe. Ordinary activities suddenly felt dangerous. The attacks themselves had already terrified communities. But the letters amplified that fear. Because now the killer wasn't merely committing crimes. He was speaking directly to the public. He was reminding everyone that he remained free. Still watching. Still capable of striking again. And perhaps preparing his next move. Meanwhile, investigators continued their search. Fingerprints were compared. Witness statements analyzed. Ballistic evidence reviewed. Suspects identified and eliminated. Thousands of hours were invested in the investigation. Yet despite all of it, the Zodiac remained beyond their reach. A shadow without a face. A voice without an identity. A killer who seemed determined to stay one step ahead. More letters arrived. Some contained threats. Others mocked investigators. Several appeared designed specifically to generate publicity. The Zodiac seemed obsessed with maintaining control over the story. Every letter guaranteed headlines. Every headline increased public fear. And every new communication reinforced the image he was carefully constructing. The legend of the Zodiac was growing. And with it, so was his confidence. Then, in September of 1969, the Zodiac changed his approach once again. Until now, his attacks had involved sudden violence. Quick encounters. Gunfire. And escape. But his next crime would be different. Far more personal. Far more terrifying. On the shores of a peaceful lake in Napa County, two college students were enjoying a quiet afternoon together. The weather was pleasant. The setting was beautiful. Everything seemed normal. Safe. Ordinary. They had no idea someone was watching them. And within hours, they would come face to face with the Zodiac Killer himself. Not in darkness. Not from a distance. But standing directly before them. Wearing a costume so bizarre and frightening that it would become one of the most recognizable images in true crime history. The legend of the Zodiac was about to become even darker. And the events at Lake Berryessa would reveal a side of the killer the world had never seen before. September 27, 1969. Lake Berryessa. Napa County, California. On the surface, it was a perfect late summer afternoon. The sun reflected off the water. A gentle breeze moved through the trees. Families enjoyed picnics along the shoreline. Boats drifted peacefully across the lake. Fishermen cast their lines into the water. Children laughed in the distance. Everything about the scene felt ordinary. Comforting. Safe. It seemed like the last place where something terrible could happen. But evil rarely announces its arrival. Sometimes it hides behind normality. Waiting patiently for the right moment. And on this particular afternoon, danger was already moving through the landscape unseen. Somewhere among the hills and trees surrounding Lake Berryessa, a killer was preparing for his next attack. A killer who had already taken lives. A killer who had already terrified Northern California. A killer who was about to reveal a side of himself more disturbing than anything investigators had seen before. Among the many visitors enjoying the lake that day were two college students. 20-year-old Brian Hartnell and 22-year-old Cecilia Shepard. The pair had chosen a quiet location near the shoreline. Away from large crowds. Away from noise and distractions. Just a peaceful place to relax and spend time together. For them, it was simply another pleasant afternoon. One that should have ended with memories and conversation. Instead, it would become one of the most infamous encounters in true crime history. As the afternoon progressed, the couple noticed something unusual. A man in the distance. At first, there was no immediate reason for alarm. The lake was a public area. People came and went throughout the day. Visitors often walked along the shoreline. Nothing about the sight of another person seemed particularly threatening. But as time passed, the stranger's behavior became increasingly unsettling. He appeared to be watching them. Moving through the area. Remaining nearby. Then he began approaching. Slowly. Deliberately. Purposefully. And with every step, the sense that something was wrong became harder to ignore. The men eventually emerged from the trees. What Brian and Cecilia saw next was unlike anything they could have expected. The stranger wore dark clothing. Covering his face was a black executioner-style hood. The hood concealed his identity completely. Only small openings allowed him to see. And on the center of his chest was a symbol. A white circle crossed by vertical and horizontal lines. The now infamous crosshair emblem. The same symbol that had appeared in letters sent to newspapers. The same symbol associated with the mysterious killer calling himself Zodiac. Whether Brian and Cecilia immediately recognized its significance remains uncertain. But one thing is clear. The sight must have been terrifying. A masked stranger, emerging from the wilderness, armed, silent, and walking directly toward them. Unlike previous Zodiac attacks, what happened next involved conversation, communication, interaction. The killer did not immediately resort to violence. Instead, he spoke. His voice was calm, controlled, measured. According to later accounts, he claimed to be an escaped convict. He told the couple that he needed money, that he needed transportation, that he wanted their vehicle. And perhaps most importantly, he insisted that he did not intend to hurt them. It was a lie. But at the time, Brian and Cecilia had no way of knowing that. Faced with an armed stranger in an isolated location, they attempted to cooperate. Brian Hartnell would later describe the men as oddly composed. There was no frantic energy, no emotional outburst, no signs of panic. Everything about his behavior suggested planning, preparation, control. It was as though he had rehearsed this encounter in his mind long before it happened. Then came another disturbing detail. The stranger produced pre-cut lengths of rope. Not improvised restraints. Not something gathered from the environment. These ropes had been brought to the scene intentionally. Prepared in advance. A clear indication that whatever was about to happen had been carefully planned. Cecilia was instructed to tie Brian's hands. Afterward, the stranger examined the knots himself. Unsatisfied, he tightened them. Then he bound Cecilia as well. This moment would later become enormously significant to investigators, because it demonstrated organization, forethought, and methodical behavior. The Zodiac hadn't arrived at Lake Berryessa and acted impulsively. He had come prepared. Prepared to control. Prepared to dominate. Prepared to kill. For a brief moment, Brian and Cecilia may have hoped the stranger would simply leave. Perhaps he truly wanted the car. Perhaps the ordeal would soon be over. Perhaps cooperation would save them. But those hopes were shattered when the stranger revealed his true intentions. His story about being an escaped convict was fiction. His claims about needing transportation were false. The entire conversation had been a deception. A carefully constructed illusion designed to gain compliance. The men had never come for their money. He had never come for their vehicle. He had come for them. What followed was one of the most horrifying attacks attributed to the Zodiac Killer. And unlike his previous crimes, this one was deeply personal. The earlier attacks had been carried out from a distance. Gunfire. Quick encounters. Minimal interaction. But at Lake Berryessa, the Zodiac stood only feet away from his victims. He could hear their voices, see their expressions, observe their fear. The attack required proximity, direct contact, a level of intimacy that investigators found deeply disturbing. When it was over, the killer did something unexpected. He didn't run. He didn't flee in panic. He didn't appear rushed. Instead, he calmly walked away. As though the violence he had just committed meant nothing. As though he had completed a task and was simply moving on to the next step of his plan. And incredibly, he wasn't finished. Before leaving the area, the Zodiac approached Brian Hartnell's vehicle. Then, using a marker, he began writing on the door. Investigators would later discover a message listing dates and locations. Lake Herman Road, Blue Rock Springs, and now Lake Berryessa. The writing served as a signature. A declaration. A public acknowledgement that the same individual was responsible for all three attacks. For detectives, the message was extraordinary. It connected multiple crime scenes, multiple victims, multiple investigations. And it removed almost any doubt that they were dealing with a serial offender. Yet despite this evidence, the most important question remained unanswered. Who was he? As the afternoon turned toward evening, help was finally summoned. Emergency responders rushed to the scene. Police officers secured the area. Investigators began documenting evidence. The scale of the attack quickly became apparent. This was unlike anything they had previously encountered. Brian Hartnell survived, and his testimony would become one of the most valuable pieces of evidence in the entire Zodiac investigation. He had spoken with the attacker, observed him, listened to his voice, experienced details no other known survivor could provide. Cecilia Shepard was transported to a hospital. For a brief time, there was hope. Hope that she might recover. Hope that she might survive. Hope that investigators could obtain even more information about the killer. Tragically, those hopes would not be realized. She later succumbed to her injuries. Another life taken by the Zodiac. Another family devastated. Another chapter added to a growing nightmare. The attack left investigators deeply puzzled. Why had the Zodiac changed his methods? Why wear a costume? Why risk spending so much time with his victims? Why engage them in conversation? Why increase the possibility of identification? The questions seemed endless. And every answer appeared to create new mysteries. Then, later that evening, history repeated itself. A telephone operator received a chilling call. The voice on the line calmly reported the crime. Just as he had after the Blue Rock Springs attack. The Zodiac once again claimed responsibility himself. It was another example of behavior investigators were beginning to recognize. The killer didn't simply want to commit crimes. He wanted ownership, recognition, credit. Police immediately examined the payphone connected to the call. They searched for fingerprints, physical evidence, anything that might identify the caller. But once again, the Zodiac remained frustratingly out of reach. Always present, yet somehow impossible to capture. Always leaving clues, yet never enough. By now, law enforcement agencies throughout Northern California were working together with increasing urgency. Ballistics evidence, witness descriptions, handwriting samples, telephone records. Every available resource was being directed toward finding the Zodiac Killer. The investigation continued to expand. More detectives, more agencies, more leads, more pressure. Yet despite all of it, the killer remained free. And even as investigators worked late into the night searching for answers, the Zodiac was already preparing his next move. His next attack would be different, bolder, riskier, and more shocking than anything that had come before. Because less than 2 weeks later, he would leave the isolation of rural Northern California behind. He would enter one of America's most famous cities. He would kill in a populated neighborhood. He would be seen by witnesses. And for the first time in the entire investigation, police would come terrifyingly close to catching him. The hunt for the Zodiac was about to enter its most dramatic chapter. By October 1969, the Zodiac Killer had already become one of the most feared criminals in America. His attacks had terrorized Northern California. His letters dominated newspaper headlines. His ciphers fascinated the public. And his taunts frustrated investigators. Yet despite months of investigation, law enforcement still knew remarkably little about the men they were hunting. No confirmed identity. No arrest. No photograph. No name beyond the one he had given himself. The Zodiac seemed to exist everywhere and nowhere at the same time. He could kill without warning, communicate directly with newspapers, threaten entire communities, and then disappear. Every clue appeared to lead into darkness. Every breakthrough seemed to create new questions. For investigators, it was becoming increasingly difficult to separate the men from the myth. And then, on October 11, 1969, the Zodiac made a decision that shocked everyone. For the first time, he would strike in the heart of a major city. Not on an isolated road. Not beside a remote lake. But in a populated San Francisco neighborhood. A place filled with homes, families, witnesses, and police. It was a level of risk unlike anything he had attempted before. And it nearly led to his capture. 59-year-old Paul Stine had spent years working as a taxi driver. Like countless cab drivers across America, he earned a living transporting passengers through city streets. His work followed a familiar routine. Pick up a fare. Drive to a destination. Move on to the next passenger. Night after night. Street after street. Nothing unusual. Nothing extraordinary. Just another shift. On the evening of October 11, 1969, San Francisco was settling into the rhythms of a typical Saturday night. Restaurants remained open. People gathered with friends. Traffic moved through the city. The cool evening air drifted through neighborhoods illuminated by streetlights. For Paul Stine, it appeared to be another ordinary evening behind the wheel. Shortly before 10 p.m., he picked up a passenger. The destination was Presidio Heights, an affluent residential neighborhood near the northern edge of San Francisco. Nothing about the request stood out. Nothing suggested danger. To Paul Stine, it was simply another fare. Another customer. Another destination. But sitting quietly in the back seat was a man whose identity remains one of the greatest mysteries in criminal history. As the taxi moved through the city, the passenger reportedly remained calm. There were no arguments. No signs of distress. No indication that anything was wrong. Outside, San Francisco carried on as normal. Streetlights reflected off parked cars. Pedestrians walked along sidewalks. The city seemed peaceful. Ordinary. Unaware that one of its most infamous crimes was about to unfold. Eventually, the cab arrived in Presidio Heights. The vehicle came to a stop near the passenger's destination. And within moments, everything changed. The attack happened quickly. Suddenly. Violently. Inside the confined space of the taxi. A place where Paul Stine likely felt completely safe only seconds before. Unlike previous Zodiac attacks, this crime occurred in a residential area. Homes overlooked the street. People were nearby. Windows faced the roadway. Potential witnesses surrounded the scene. The Zodiac had abandoned the isolation that had protected him during earlier attacks. And yet, somehow, he still believed he could escape. That confidence would prove chillingly justified. What the Zodiac could not control was who happened to be looking out their windows that night. Several nearby witnesses observed activity around the taxi. From their vantage points, they saw a man near the vehicle. A man behaving in a manner that immediately drew attention. The witnesses later provided descriptions to investigators. They described an adult white male. Heavy-set or stocky in appearance. Wearing glasses. Appearing older than many had expected. Most strikingly, they reported that he seemed calm. Composed. Unhurried. There was no frantic escape. No desperate sprint away from the scene. No visible panic. Instead, the man appeared almost casual. As though what had just occurred meant little to him. For detectives, this detail was deeply disturbing. Experienced criminals often make mistakes after committing a violent crime. Fear causes errors. Adrenaline creates panic. But the Zodiac seemed different. His behavior suggested confidence. Control. Perhaps even experience. He appeared to believe he would get away. And for the moment, he was right. Once witnesses contacted police, events unfolded rapidly. Descriptions were relayed through police dispatch. Officers responded immediately. Patrol units flooded the area. Roads were monitored. The search began within minutes. For the first time in the Zodiac investigation, law enforcement had an opportunity to catch the killer while he was still nearby. Then came a mistake. One that would haunt the investigation for decades. According to later accounts, a communication error may have resulted in responding officers receiving inaccurate information regarding the suspect's description. As patrol cars moved into position, some officers may have been searching for the wrong person. A small mistake. A brief misunderstanding. Yet one with potentially enormous consequences. Because somewhere in Presidio Heights, the Zodiac was still moving through the neighborhood. And every passing minute increased his chances of escape. What happened next remains one of the most extraordinary moments in the entire Zodiac case. One responding officer later reported encountering a man in the area. A lone figure walking along the street. Not running. Not hiding. Simply walking. The individual appeared calm. Unconcerned. Almost as though he belonged there. Because of the information available at the time, the encounter did not result in an arrest. The man was allowed to continue on his way. And within moments, he disappeared into the darkness. Years later, investigators would revisit the incident repeatedly. Was the man actually the Zodiac Killer? Had police unknowingly crossed paths with America's most infamous unidentified murderer? Had the case come within minutes of being solved? No one knows for certain. But if the man encountered that night truly was the Zodiac, then October 11, 1969 may represent the closest law enforcement ever came to capturing him. A fleeting moment. A missed opportunity. And another mystery added to an already legendary case. Just days later, another envelope arrived. By now, Zodiac letters had become familiar to newspaper editors. But this communication contained something different. Something that removed all doubt. Inside the envelope was a piece of Paul Stine's shirt. The message was unmistakable. The sender was directly connected to the crime. This was not a hoax. Not a copycat. Not an attention seeker. The Zodiac had once again proven his involvement. And once again, he had chosen to communicate through the media. For investigators, the evidence was both valuable and infuriating. It confirmed the authenticity of the letter. Yet it also demonstrated that the Zodiac remained one step ahead. He had committed a murder. Escaped a citywide search. And then calmly mailed proof of his success. The psychological impact was enormous. Not only on police, but on the public as well. Until this point, many people viewed the Zodiac's crimes as tragedies connected to isolated locations. Remote roads. Secluded parks. Areas most residents could simply avoid. But the murder of Paul Stine shattered that illusion. The Zodiac had struck in a major city. On a residential street. Near witnesses. Near police. Near ordinary citizens living their everyday lives. If he could kill there, where couldn't he kill? That question lingered in the minds of countless Californians. And it was precisely the type of fear the Zodiac seemed determined to create. As the months passed, the letters continued. Some contained cryptic statements. Others mocked investigators. Several included threats that alarmed both authorities and the public. In one communication, the Zodiac threatened schoolchildren. The message generated immediate concern. Parents worried for their families. Schools reviewed safety procedures. Law enforcement increased patrols throughout affected communities. Whether the Zodiac ever intended to carry out those threats remains unknown. But intent was almost secondary. Because by now, the fear itself had become part of the crime. The Zodiac understood something many criminals do not. Fear spreads farther than violence. And once released, it becomes difficult to contain. By the end of 1969, the investigation had become massive. Local police departments coordinated with neighboring jurisdictions. State agencies contributed resources. Federal authorities became involved. Thousands of leads poured in. Potential suspects emerged from every direction. Some appeared promising. Others quickly fell apart. Every tip had to be evaluated. Every possibility had to be explored. Yet despite the effort, the central mystery remained unchanged. Who was the Zodiac? The killer seemed to exist just beyond reach. Close enough to leave evidence. Close enough to send letters. Close enough to taunt investigators. Yet always distant enough to avoid identification. It was a maddening paradox. And it would continue frustrating detectives for decades. By the close of 1969, the Zodiac Killer had achieved something few criminals ever accomplish. He had transformed himself into a legend. Not because of who he was, but because nobody knew who he was. Fear. Attention. Public fascination. The Zodiac had cultivated all of it. But his most enduring weapon was neither a gun nor a knife. It was mystery. A mystery encoded in letters. Hidden inside ciphers. Buried beneath decades of unanswered questions. For years to come, investigators, journalists, cryptographers, and amateur detectives would devote themselves to unraveling those secrets. Some believed the ciphers concealed his identity. Others believed they contained clues to future crimes. And a few wondered whether the Zodiac had hidden the truth in plain sight all along. The next chapter of the story would focus not on murder scenes, but on the messages he left behind. Messages that continue to challenge experts more than half a century later. And perhaps, messages that may still hold the key to discovering who the Zodiac Killer really was. While the Zodiac Killer's crimes shocked the public, it was his letters that made him immortal. Long after the murders themselves faded from newspaper front pages, people remained captivated by the messages he left behind. The ciphers. The threats. The taunts. The strange claims. And the possibility that somewhere within those symbols lay the answer investigators had been searching for since 1968. His true identity. For decades, that possibility would fuel countless investigations, documentaries, books, and theories. Because unlike most serial killers, the Zodiac didn't simply leave behind crime scenes. He left behind puzzles. And humanity has always been fascinated by mysteries waiting to be solved. The Zodiac's obsession with communication set him apart from many criminals. Most killers attempt to avoid attention. They hide evidence, avoid publicity, and hope their crimes remain disconnected. The Zodiac appeared to want the exact opposite. He wanted the world watching. He wanted newspapers discussing him. He wanted police responding to him. And perhaps most importantly, he wanted control over the story. Every letter served a purpose. Some spread fear. Others mocked investigators. Several seemed designed specifically to generate headlines. The murders may have made him dangerous, but the letters made him famous. And fame appeared to be something he valued deeply. In many ways, the Zodiac wasn't simply committing crimes. He was constructing a public identity. Building a character. Creating a legend. One envelope at a time. The first major cipher arrived in July of 1969. Divided into 3 sections and mailed to separate newspapers, the message immediately captured public attention. At first glance, the code appeared impossible. Rows of strange symbols stretched across the page. Triangles. Circles. Crosses. Unfamiliar characters arranged in seemingly random patterns. Police examined the cipher. Military cryptographers studied it. Experts searched for hidden meaning. Yet for days, no one could unlock its secrets. The mystery only increased public fascination. Everywhere people discussed possible solutions. Friends debated theories. Families gathered around newspapers. Amateur codebreakers filled notebooks with calculations and guesses. The entire nation seemed to be trying to solve the Zodiac's puzzle. Then, unexpectedly, the breakthrough came from an ordinary married couple. Donald and Betty Harden. Working from their home, they approached the cipher with patience and determination. Night after night, they analyzed patterns. Tested assumptions. Examined repeating symbols. Slowly, a message began to emerge. And when the code was finally cracked, the contents shocked the public. The writer described violence in deeply disturbing terms. He appeared to view human life with cold detachment. His words offered a glimpse into a mind that investigators were desperately trying to understand. Yet despite all the effort required to solve the cipher, one critical piece of information remained absent. His name. The code revealed his thoughts. But not his identity. The public had unlocked the puzzle. The mystery remained. As 1969 turned into 1970, the stream of communications continued. New letters arrived. New threats appeared. And new ciphers challenged investigators. Some messages referenced current events. Others appeared designed solely to provoke reactions. The Zodiac seemed fascinated by his own notoriety. Almost as if he were monitoring public response and adjusting his behavior accordingly. For investigators, each letter created new opportunities. But also new problems. Every communication had to be authenticated. Every detail had to be examined. And increasingly, another challenge emerged. Imposters. The Zodiac's growing fame inspired countless hoaxes. Suddenly, police departments and newspapers were receiving anonymous messages from individuals claiming to be the killer. Some were obvious fakes. Others appeared convincing enough to demand serious investigation. Valuable time and resources were consumed chasing leads that ultimately went nowhere. The real Zodiac was difficult enough to find. Now detectives also had to identify those pretending to be him. While the 408-symbol cipher had eventually been solved, several later codes proved far more resistant. Years passed. Then decades. The messages remained unsolved. Cryptography experts from around the world attempted solutions. Computer scientists developed programs designed to identify patterns. Professional analysts examined every symbol. Yet the answers remained hidden. Some investigators began questioning whether meaningful answers existed at all. Perhaps the Zodiac had intentionally created nonsense. Perhaps the ciphers were designed only to waste time. Perhaps the mystery itself was the point. The uncertainty became part of the legend. Because as long as the codes remained unsolved, possibilities remained endless. Every unanswered question allowed new theories to flourish. And the Zodiac seemed to understand the power of uncertainty better than anyone. While cryptographers focused on the codes, detectives continued searching for the men behind them. Evidence was collected from multiple crime scenes. Ballistics comparisons were performed. Fingerprints were analyzed. Handwriting experts examined every letter. Witness descriptions were reviewed repeatedly. Thousands of leads poured into law enforcement agencies. Some appeared promising. Others collapsed almost immediately. Potential suspects emerged from every corner of California. Teachers. Military veterans. Businessmen. Former criminals. Ordinary citizens. At times, investigators seemed close to breakthroughs. Then the evidence would fall apart. The case became a maze of possibilities. Each new lead offering hope. Each dead end generating frustration. The deeper investigators searched, the more elusive the Zodiac appeared. It often felt as though they weren't hunting a man. They were hunting a ghost. A figure capable of briefly entering people's lives. Creating chaos. And vanishing without leaving enough behind to identify him. As the early 1970s progressed, something unexpected happened. The letters began arriving less frequently. The constant stream of communication slowed. The headlines became less regular. The public attention gradually shifted elsewhere. For investigators, this raised difficult questions. Had the Zodiac died? Had he moved away? Had he been imprisoned for another crime? Or had he simply chosen to stop? No one knew. And perhaps most unsettling of all, no one could be certain that he was truly gone. The possibility remained that the Zodiac was still alive. Still watching. Still reading the news. Still observing the investigation from a distance. A silent spectator to the fear he had created. Eventually, the investigation entered a new phase. The active manhunt slowly transformed into a cold case. Evidence was archived. Files were stored. Investigators retired. Witnesses grew older. Memories became less reliable. The passage of time presented challenges no detective could control. Physical evidence deteriorates. Witness recollections fade. Opportunities disappear. Each passing year made solving the case more difficult. Yet despite those obstacles, public fascination never vanished. Books were written. Television programs revisited the mystery. Researchers continued examining evidence. And a new generation discovered the story for themselves. The Zodiac Killer had become something larger than a criminal investigation. He had become a cultural obsession. A puzzle spanning generations. Then, more than half a century after the murders began, something remarkable happened. One of the Zodiac's most famous unsolved messages was finally deciphered. the so-called 340 cipher. A code that had frustrated experts since 1969. For decades, it resisted every attempt at decryption. Countless individuals tried and failed. The mystery endured. Then, in 2020, a team of civilian codebreakers succeeded. Using modern computing techniques, pattern analysis, and extraordinary persistence, they finally unlocked the message. The breakthrough generated international headlines. News organizations around the world covered the story. Once again, the Zodiac was making headlines decades after his crimes. Yet even this incredible achievement failed to provide the answer everyone wanted. The decoded message still did not reveal his identity. No confession. No name. No final revelation. Only another glimpse into the mind of a man who remained unknown. For more than 50 years, investigators accumulated evidence. Witness accounts. Fingerprints. Handwriting samples. Crime scene reports. Ballistic comparisons. Photographs. Letters. Ciphers. Thousands upon thousands of pages documenting one of the most extensive investigations in American criminal history. Yet despite all of it, one question survived. One question continued haunting detectives, journalists, and researchers alike. Who was the Zodiac Killer? Not what he wrote. Not how he killed. Not where he struck. But who he actually was. A name. A face. A life hidden behind the mythology. Because somewhere beneath the ciphers, the headlines, and the fear, there had to be a real person. And finding that person became the ultimate goal of the investigation. Over the decades, countless names would be connected to the Zodiac mystery. Some were quickly dismissed. Others remained subjects of debate for years. Investigators developed theories. Authors proposed suspects. Amateur researchers uncovered new evidence. And entire books were dedicated to identifying the men behind the crimes. But among all the names ever associated with the case, one suspect would stand above the rest. A man whose connection to the Zodiac mystery would generate decades of controversy. A man who, for many people, seemed to fit the profile almost perfectly. Was he truly the Zodiac Killer? Or was he simply the most convincing suspect in a case built on uncertainty? The next chapter would explore the suspects, the evidence, the theories, and the ongoing search for the face behind one of history's most enduring criminal mysteries. A dark evidence room. Shelves lined with dusty boxes. Photographs hanging on evidence boards. The Zodiac symbol slowly appears in the darkness. Then fades away. More than 50 years have passed since the Zodiac Killer first emerged from the shadows. More than 5 decades since the murders. The letters. The ciphers. The fear. And yet, despite one of the most extensive investigations in American criminal history, the case remains unsolved. No arrest. No conviction. No confirmed identity. Only questions. Questions that continue to haunt investigators, researchers, journalists, and ordinary people around the world. Because after everything, the greatest mystery may not be who the Zodiac was. It may be how he managed to vanish. Looking back, investigators faced enormous obstacles from the very beginning. The crimes occurred across multiple jurisdictions. Vallejo, Napa County, San Francisco. Different agencies. Different investigators. Different procedures. Today, information can be shared instantly. Databases connect law enforcement agencies across entire countries. But in the late 1960s, communication was slower. Coordination was more difficult. And critical information could easily become fragmented. Every agency possessed pieces of the puzzle. Yet assembling those pieces proved extraordinarily difficult. The Zodiac exploited those limitations. Whether intentionally or not, he operated across jurisdictional boundaries. Each attack created new investigative challenges. Each crime scene generated new evidence. New witnesses. New reports. And new opportunities for information to become lost in the complexity of the case. Of all the moments discussed in Zodiac history, none receives more attention than the events following the murder of Paul Stine. The possibility that police may have encountered the Zodiac and unknowingly allowed him to walk away has become one of the most debated aspects of the investigation. If the reports are accurate, the Zodiac may have come closer to capture that night than at any other point in the case. A brief encounter. A misunderstanding. A missed opportunity. And then he was gone. Forever. At least as far as investigators know. Whether that encounter truly involved the Zodiac can never be known with complete certainty. But the possibility continues to haunt the case. Because if true, history may have turned on a single moment. Modern audiences often assume that forensic science can solve almost any crime. DNA databases. Advanced laboratory techniques. Digital analysis. Powerful investigative tools. But investigators in the late 1960s operated in a very different world. Many technologies that exist today had not yet been developed. DNA profiling did not exist. Computerized databases were limited. Evidence collection procedures varied widely. The Zodiac committed his crimes during a period when forensic science was far less advanced. And that timing may have worked in his favor. By the time modern technology became available, decades had already passed. Evidence had aged. Some materials had deteriorated. Witness memories had faded. Potential suspects had died. The passage of time had become an obstacle almost as significant as the killer himself. Some investigators believe the Zodiac benefited from something remarkably simple. Luck. Not extraordinary intelligence. Not elaborate conspiracies. Not supernatural skill. Simply luck. Being in the right place. At the right time. Making just enough successful decisions to avoid capture. History is filled with criminals who escaped justice because of fortunate circumstances. Perhaps the Zodiac was one of them. Perhaps a witness looked away at the wrong moment. Perhaps a piece of evidence was overlooked. Perhaps a suspect was dismissed too quickly. Perhaps one tiny detail prevented investigators from discovering the truth. And once that opportunity passed, it never returned. As the years passed, the Zodiac evolved from a criminal case into something larger. A legend. A cultural phenomenon. A mystery passed from one generation to the next. The murders became history. The mystery became immortal. Books attempted to identify him. Films dramatized the investigation. Researchers devoted years of their lives to studying the evidence. Entire communities formed around the search for answers. Few criminal cases have maintained public fascination for so long. Because unlike many mysteries, the Zodiac case offers no satisfying conclusion. No courtroom verdict. No confession. No final chapter. Only possibilities. And perhaps that is why interest in the case endures. Humans are naturally drawn to unfinished stories. We seek conclusions. Answers. Resolution. The Zodiac provides none of those things. Instead, it offers uncertainty. And uncertainty is difficult to ignore. Even today, the search continues. New theories emerge regularly. Old evidence is re-examined. Advances in forensic science provide occasional hope. Researchers revisit witness statements. Analyze letters. Study ciphers. Compare suspects. Every few years, headlines appear claiming the mystery has finally been solved. Yet once the claims are examined, the same problem remains. Evidence. Definitive proof. The standard required to transform theory into fact. And so far, no theory has met that standard. Everything slowly merges together. Perhaps somewhere, hidden within an old file, a forgotten clue still exists. Perhaps new technology will eventually reveal answers investigators could never access. Or perhaps the truth disappeared with the man himself. We may never know. And that possibility is both fascinating and unsettling. Because somewhere behind every letter, every cipher, every threat, every murder, there was a real person. A human being who walked among ordinary people. Who blended into everyday life. who managed to remain hidden while becoming one of the most infamous criminals in modern history. And that reality is perhaps the most chilling aspect of all. More than half a century later, the Zodiac Killer remains unidentified. His crimes continue to be studied. His letters continue to be analyzed. His ciphers continue to fascinate. But the central question remains unanswered. Evidence. Definitive proof. The standard required to transform theory into fact. And so far, no theory has met that standard. Everything slowly merges together. Perhaps somewhere, hidden within an old file, a forgotten clue still exists. Perhaps new technology will eventually reveal answers investigators could never access. Or perhaps the truth disappeared with the man himself. We may never know. And that possibility is both fascinating and unsettling. Because somewhere behind every letter, every cipher, every threat, every murder, there was a real person. A human being who walked among ordinary people. Who blended into everyday life. Who managed to remain hidden while becoming one of the most infamous criminals in modern history. And that reality is perhaps the most chilling aspect of all. More than half a century later, the Zodiac Killer remains unidentified. His crimes continue to be studied. His letters continue to be analyzed. His ciphers continue to fascinate. But the central question remains unanswered. Who was the Zodiac Killer? Until that question is answered, the case remains open. The mystery remains alive. And the legend of the Zodiac endures. Slowly scrolling archival photographs. Newspaper headlines. Crime scene locations. Evidence files. The final image is the Zodiac symbol. It slowly fades away. If you enjoyed this documentary, remember to subscribe and turn on notifications for more deep investigations into history's greatest unsolved mysteries. And let us know in the comments. Who do you believe was the Zodiac Killer? Or do you think the truth will never be known? Thank you for watching. And until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.